My name is Anna Miti, and I officially welcome you to the program, The Big Question. As I mentioned earlier today that we're talking about democracy and development. So with me in the studio, very distinguished guest. He's been all over the world, having been traveling in more than 101 countries, where he gets to talk about this issue and others. His name is Professor Dr. Peter Baofu, who's written over 150 books that looks at the social sciences, the humanities, the natural sciences, and the formal sciences in relation to the mind, the social, the society, nature, and culture. And he also looks at his visions of what the future of humanity is like. In your view, when you hear people talking about democracy and development in currently as we stand, and people say that there's no democracy in Africa, or their vision of what democracy should look like, in your view, what is on the ground at the moment in terms of democracy and development?
I just want to make a few clarifications first in that question, because it has some certain assumptions which can be quite questionable and misleading. And number one is that democracy is a question about politics.
Yes.
Development is a question about economics. So you do not confuse politics and economics. Are they related? Of course they are.
Yes.
They are related, but you should not confuse between the two. That is the first clarification. Clarification number one is that many of the discussions about democracy and development have been quite Western-centric. For example, in terms of development, people often use Western standards. Let's say modernization nowadays, you have to be modernized. In many cases, that means you have to be like the Western world. And in many other cases too, in case of democracy, when you talk about democratic, they often mean the Western standards, which means that you have to be like the liberal democratic institution in America or in Western Europe or something like that. I think that is very misleading, but also very dangerous to have this kind of thinking, because you are imposing values and beliefs on one region of the world on the rest of the world, and that is not going to solve many of the problems that we face nowadays in humanity, because many of those problems are not just international but also local. So you have to understand both of them in order to have a good solution to many of these issues in the longer term. Africa is no exception about that. So election, as you just mentioned, is a good example. Just because you have an election doesn't mean that the country is democratic. By the way, Nazi Germany had election too. Doesn't mean that Nazi Germany was democratic. The Soviet Union had election too, regularly. And the turnout rate is like 90-something%. Doesn't mean that the Soviet Union was democratic. Just because you have election doesn't mean anything by itself. In fact, in a large so-called liberal democratic society, when they have a lot of all these elections, the voters are very, very upset about the performance and the behaviors of all those politicians. They are so corrupt. They always make promises and promises and promises. In the end, they don't do much of anything, and social problems are accumulating. So again, we need to question all these kind of assumptions and linkages that we talk about almost on a daily basis.
With the elections, and I like the fact that you're mentioning here that there are these differences, and we like to think of the westernized democracy as the golden standard. So you find that there are these tenets that are put forward in the global system to say elections are observed and somebody has to declare them free and fair. And mostly it's the AU, the EU, and other entities like that. At the moment, in your view, are those entities doing the correct thing? Are they? Do you think this is the way that they should work, especially in terms of then wanting to endorse elections, as it were?
Yeah, I don't think in the way that you do in terms of the dichotomy between election or non-election. Election is good, non-election is bad. This kind of dichotomy, I don't think in this kind of strict ideology. It's very ideological. I'm much more pragmatic and realistic. I do think that elections have a lot of good things about them, but also a lot of bad things about them. Non-election has a lot of good things about them, but also a lot of bad things about them. It depends on what you like in life, in your society, in your culture, in your identity. For example, just like do you like apples or do you like bananas? Well, if you like bananas, that means that you may not like apples. But if you like apples, then you may not like bananas. Doesn't mean that bananas are better than apples. I think it depends on you as a person. So in this case, as an analogy, it depends on your culture, your society, your nature, and your mind. In this case, the mindset where you live. So I think that is very important. If you look into that way, and all of a sudden the so-called golden standard, universal standard, just disappears in thin air, becoming ideology. So it's much better in this case for Africa. It doesn't matter too much whether you have election or non-election. The point is, if you can have good leaders which can help you to fix problem, then the system is very good. It's doing the job. And if they are not doing the job, I don't care if you have the election or not. Look at many of those elections in the Western world now, just how disappointing they are.
Yes.
Look at all those leaders, the way that they behave, the way that they govern. In many ways, it's just contrary to many of the wishes that we may have to fix social problem in society. So why do you think you have to copy them in order to fix your own problem? You're creating more problems for yourself.
All right, Professor Dr. Peter Baofu is an author, a scholar, and many, many things. And he was here to answer the big question that we had for you this evening. Do stand by for the news bulletin at 8 coming up next.